This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome, curious minds. Buckle up, because today we're taking a deep dive into Nepal. For many, it's simply that stunning Himalayan nation nestled between the two Asian giants, India and China. But beneath that, let's say, serene exterior, its political landscape has been in this constant state of, fascinating and often frustrating flux.
Expert, for those of us watching Nepal's political carousel from afar, what made 2024 such an astonishing, almost dizzying year in its political history?
Well, 2024, it really pushed the boundaries of political volatility, even for Nepal. I mean, it was quite something. We saw Prime Minister Pushpa Kamal Dahal, Prachanda as he's known, dramatically break with the Nepali Congress back in March. And then he forged this new alliance with the CPN-UML. Now, that alone was a pretty significant shift.
Right. But then, come July, the whole political chessboard was, entirely upended again. The two biggest and historically really hostile forces, the CPN-UML, led by KP Sharma Oli, and the Nepali Congress, they formed this unexpected grand coalition.
Yeah.
And that brought Oli back as PM for, the fourth time now?
Wow.
Yeah, it was just this...
It certainly sounds like a high-stakes game of political musical chairs. And this brings us right to a fundamental question, doesn't it? Hanging over Nepal's future. Is this grand coalition a genuine attempt, maybe, to finally achieve some stability, to kickstart those vital economic reforms? Or perhaps, is it just another cynical power-sharing deal? Part of that endless cycle of self-serving politics that, frankly, seems doomed to fail. Our mission today is to unpack the sources you've shared, try to understand Nepal's chronic political instability, see how it's actively blocking crucial economic reforms, and maybe discern what businesses and citizens can truly expect before the next elections roll around in 2027. Okay, let's unpack this. That wild political carousel we just talked about. It isn't just some random occurrence, is it? It feels like a symptom of something deeper, a systemic issue in Nepalese politics. Since the monarchy was abolished in 2008 and Nepal became a federal democratic republic, the country seems caught in this continuous loop. Fragile coalition governments form, and then almost inevitably they just collapse. Expert, what's fundamentally driving this seemingly endless cycle of instability?
Well, it's fascinating, actually, because the very design of Nepal's electoral system, it kind of contributes directly to this. It uses a mix, you see. It combines both majoritarian and proportional representation principles.
Okay.
Now, while the idea is good to ensure broad representation, the practical outcome is almost always a fragmented parliament. No single party can consistently get an absolute majority.
Yeah, right.
Which means coalition government isn't just common, it's basically a fait accompli. It's an unavoidable reality of the system. And this constant need for parties to form alliances, often really tenuous ones, that's the deep root of the fragility we keep seeing.
And within this inherently fragmented system, we consistently see this triangle of power dominating the political chessboard. You've got KP Sharma Oli, the strong, often controversial leader of the CPN-UML, who's now back as PM. Then there's Dubba from the Nepali Congress. It's the country's oldest party, traditionally seen as more centrist, maybe pro-Indian. And finally, Pushpa Kamal Dahal, or Prachanda, from the CPN Maoist Centre. What's really fascinating is how Prachanda, even though his party is often only the third largest, has so skillfully played this kingmaker role,
Yeah.
shifting alliances to keep his influence, which seems quite outsized sometimes.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes abundantly clear that these frequent shifts in coalitions, they're rarely driven by deep ideological differences.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, the real driving forces are, the personal ambitions of these leaders. Intense behind-the-scenes negotiations on how ministerial jobs get divided up. And just the raw struggle for power, frankly. The constant breaks and then reconciliations between Oli and Prachanda, for instance. That's a textbook example of this dynamic. This intense party politics, this sort of ideological tribalism, it consistently leads to poor governance. And a real lack of continuity in public policy. And that's incredibly damaging for the country's development, obviously.
So given that whole backdrop, what's the deeper logic behind this new grand coalition, the one between CPN-UML and the Nepali Congress? Why would two forces that have historically been so hostile suddenly decide to unite? I mean, does a coalition of convenience like this ever truly lead to genuine stability, or is it just, kicking the can down the road?
It's a really good question. Fundamentally, this alliance looks like a defensive maneuver. Yes. The two main establishment parties, the Nepali Congress and the CPN-UML, They're clearly reacting to the growing influence of newer, smaller parties, like the National Independent Party, the RSP, which has gained significant ground in recent elections. These newer forces were starting to, shall we say, exert disproportionate influence. They were getting key ministerial posts in exchange for supporting previous fragile coalitions, and that clearly irritated the old political heavyweights.
Ah, okay. So it's about control.
Pretty much. So this grand coalition is less about some shared vision for Nepal's future and much more about a common interest, regaining control over the political system, and importantly, maybe changing those electoral laws that have led to so much fragmentation of power in the first place. It's a pragmatic coming together, definitely not an ideological one.
A coalition of convenience, as you said.
Yeah.
Immediately makes you think of the risks, doesn't it? Expert, what are the biggest dangers of consolidating power in an alliance like this, especially given Nepal's history of, well, personality-driven politics?
It is an extremely risky venture, precisely because its success hangs entirely on the personal relationships and the strict adherence to power-sharing agreements between Oli and Duba. If this alliance collapses, and let's face it, it could collapse due to the same personality conflicts that have plagued Nepalese politics for decades, it could trigger a really profound crisis of faith in the entire democratic system.
Because it would show.
It would show that even a government with a large, comfortable majority can't provide stability. And an outcome like that could give a powerful boost to anti-system movements. We're already seeing growing protests calling for the restoration of the monarchy and for Nepal to become a Hindu state again. This could really fuel that fire.
It's quite a ride, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let's just quickly put some dates on this political roller coaster just to fully grasp the speed of it all. So, March 2024, Prime Minister Dahal breaks his coalition with Nepali Congress, forms a new government with CPN-UML. Then just 2 months later, May 2024, the Janata Samajwadi Party quits the Dahal government, shows its fragility again. Then, July 2024, the CPN-UML and Nepali Congress formed this new grand coalition, making KP Sharma Oli Prime Minister again. And the drama just kept going into October 2024, didn't it? With the arrest of the former Deputy PM Rabi Lemashane, leader of that new RSP party, on fraud charges.
Yes, and that was widely seen as politically motivated by many observers. Just adds another layer of tension.
That relentless struggle for power we've just been describing, it's not just some abstract political game, is it? It casts a long, very damaging shadow over Nepal's economic future. Let's connect these dots now directly. See how this political instability is actually holding back the country's economic potential. Because at first glance, Nepal's economic outlook seems, well, moderately optimistic. You see institutions like the World Bank, the ADB, forecasting decent growth for the next few years. But expert, what's the foundation of deep structural problems hiding beneath those seemingly positive numbers?
Yeah, those headline figures, they do unfortunately hide a reality of growth that's quite fragile, very dependent, and crucially not very inclusive. The critical dependence on remittances is probably the prime example.
Right. The money sent home.
Exactly. Money sent home by millions of Nepalese working abroad. It accounts for about a quarter, maybe even more, of the country's GDP. Now, while these remittances have absolutely played a decisive role in reducing extreme poverty levels, which is good, they are also, ironically, sort of evidence of the state's failure to create enough decent jobs within Nepal itself. It points to a deeper issue. A fundamental lack of internal economic dynamism, a lack of a robust productive sector driving growth from within.
And that brings us to the really profound human cost of this situation, the mass outflow of youth. Our sources highlight that more than 2,000 young people are leaving Nepal for study or work abroad every single day. They just don't see a viable future at home. It's quite stark.
It is.
And for those who do stay, youth unemployment remains alarmingly high, around 20.8% in 2024, according to the data. This brain drain, this labor force exodus, it's a colossal loss for national development, isn't it? It undermines the very foundation of future growth by stripping Nepal of its most valuable asset, its young, dynamic population.
Absolutely. It's a huge structural weakness. And beyond remittances and the youth exodus, Nepal's economy struggles with, well, industrial stagnation. Manufacturing has been in decline for decades now, really. And exports contribute very little to economic growth overall.
Which leads to
a huge and growing trade deficit. The country is just heavily dependent on imports, particularly from India. And compounding all this, both private and public investment remains stubbornly low. And overall labor productivity is weak. These aren't small issues. These are fundamental barriers to achieving sustainable, inclusive development.
But what's truly puzzling, perhaps, is this paradox.
Official data show record low inflation. It fell to 2.77% in May 2025, the lowest in 4 years. But as you talk to people, for most Nepalese families, these are just numbers on paper. They're facing a severe cost of living crisis, prices for basic foods, rent, education, but they keep rising.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating disconnect. So when the government is touting these low inflation figures, they're essentially reporting economic stagnation, not really progress. But some might argue, well, any stability in prices is a good thing for consumers, isn't it? Expert, how do we reconcile that public perception with the underlying economic reality, and what message does that actually send?
That's precisely the core of the problem. This low inflation, it isn't a sign of a healthy, affordable economy at all. Rather, it's a symptom of what's been described as a policy-induced economic downturn.
Policy-induced?
Yes. The Confederation of Nepal Industries, the CNI, they confirm this. They report that demand in the economy is critically low. Industries are operating at only maybe 30–40% of their capacity.
Wow, that low.
That low? This suppressed demand naturally keeps prices down. Less demand, less pressure on prices. But it also means economic stagnation and a severe lack of job creation. The growth that is recorded, it largely comes from those external factors like remittances, not from vigorous domestic economic activity.
So less money circulating.
Right, less money circulating within the country slows inflation, but it also means a fundamental lack of development and opportunity for people. And this gap, this perception gap you mentioned, between official figures and lived reality, it creates a dangerous situation. When the government reports positive data on GDP or inflation that just doesn't match people's everyday experience, it dramatically undermines trust in state institutions. And that trust is already incredibly low. I think one source mentioned only 44% of the population trusts political parties.
Yeah.
Ultimately, this frustration fuels public discontent, it fuels protests, social unrest, creating yet another layer of instability that actively discourages investors and further slows down those vital reforms we need.
It's a really stark picture. Let's just quickly look at some of those key economic indicators again from our sources, just underscore this point. Real GDP growth. 3.9% actual in 2024, with forecasts around 4.4% to 4.5% for 2025. Average inflation, 4.8% actual in 2024, forecast maybe 4.9% to 5.2% in 2025. So still low historically. Youth unemployment stuck high at 20.8% in 2024. Foreign direct investment, FDI, stubbornly low, less than 0.1% of GDP in 2024. Really negligible.
Tiny.
And the trade balance in April 2025 showing a staggering deficit of NPR, $434.9 billion, just massive. The link then between Nepal's chronic political instability and its economic stagnation.
Yeah.
It's not some abstract academic concept, is it? It manifests itself in these concrete, tangible failures, where political battles are directly blocking economic development. Can you give us some really striking examples of this, expert? How politics directly stalls the economy?
Oh, absolutely. Perhaps the most striking recent example was the whole situation surrounding the discussion of the state budget for 2025-2026. Opposition parties, particularly the National Independent Party, RSP, and the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party, RPP, they blocked the work of Parliament for several weeks, completely stalled it.
Why? What was the issue?
Their main demand was the resignation of a minister who was implicated in a cooperative fraud scandal. And as a result, these key pre-budget debates, crucial for setting economic policy, were just left in limbo. The most fundamental process of economic governance was paralyzed by a single political conflict. It clearly demonstrates how the struggle for power puts the entire economic life of the country on hold.
Wow. Beyond just the budget process, let's talk about Nepal's main economic asset, hydropower. The country has this colossal potential, doesn't it? Estimated at 83,000 megawatts, with about 45,000 megawatts considered economically viable. Huge number.
Enormous potential.
And developing this sector seems absolutely key for reducing Nepal's huge trade deficit, maybe even turning it into a major electricity exporter to India and Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Yet its development is chronically, frustratingly delayed. It sounds less like strategic energy development and more like a high-stakes game of political pass the parcel with these vital infrastructure projects, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That's a good way to put it. The reasons for these chronic delays in hydropower development are primarily political and bureaucratic. Frequent changes of government, as we've discussed, lead to constant policy revisions. They lead to cancellations of previously concluded contracts, redistribution of projects. The Budi Gandaki project is a classic textbook example. Its contract was first given to a Chinese company, then, after government change, transferred to India, and then eventually returned to Nepal's own state utility to manage.
Just back and forth.
Exactly. Such unpredictability makes any kind of long-term planning impossible for investors. They just can't rely on anything. And on top of that political chaos, projects get bogged down for years in bureaucratic red tape. Overlapping departmental powers, protracted permitting processes. It's a nightmare for developers.
And there's a geopolitical angle too, right?
Yes, the situation is definitely aggravated by the fact that hydropower in Nepal isn't just an economic sector, it's also become an arena for geopolitical struggle, mainly between India and China. Every major project tends to be viewed through the prism of these two regional powers' interests, which adds yet another layer of complexity and risk to an already volatile domestic political scene. So for any private investor, whether domestic or foreign, investing heavily in such an environment becomes an extremely risky proposition, understandably so.
So what's the word from businesses themselves, from the private sector on the ground? How are they reacting to all this instability?
Well, the private sector, represented by organizations like the Federation of Nepal Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FNCCI, and the Confederation of Nepalese Industry, CNI, they have a pretty unanimous voice on this. Businesses are simply exhausted by the instability. That's the overwhelming sentiment.
Just worn out.
Completely. Entrepreneurs constantly complain about the lack of a predictable legal framework, sudden changes in tax laws, restrictive central bank directives that stifle investment activity.
Yeah.
It's a constant battle. And probably the most accurate barometer of this risk perception is that huge gap we talked about earlier between declared foreign direct investment and what actually arrives in the country.
Right, the commitments versus the reality.
Exactly. In the first 9 months of the current fiscal year, FDI commitments nearly doubled to NPR 57.97 billion, partly because they simplified some procedures.
Okay, sounds good on paper.
But the real influx of capital remains abysmally low. Just NPR 8.49 billion actually came in over 8 months. That's less than 0.1% of GDP. This massive gap, it speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does.
It shows that foreign investors, they see the potential in Nepal's economy, especially in sectors like tourism, IT, hydropower. The potential is obvious. But they are simply not prepared to risk their capital in conditions of total political uncertainty and unpredictability. They're just taking a wait-and-see attitude, sitting on the sidelines. And those government attempts to bypass parliament sometimes, using decrees to push through economic legislation amendments, businesses don't see those as solutions. They see them as dangerous precedents that actually undermine faith in the rule of law, making things even less predictable long-term.
Okay. Despite this rather bleak picture you've painted, expert, is there any consensus on a clear path forward? I mean, what does this all mean for actually unlocking Nepal's potential? It sounds like the roadmap isn't about discovering entirely new magical solutions, but perhaps more about finally implementing these existing well-known reforms. So what's the biggest hurdle to translating these, frankly, quite sensible ideas into real-world progress?
You're absolutely right. Fortunately, there is a broad consensus among international experts, local stakeholders, on the steps needed to unlock Nepal's economic potential. World Bank reports, particularly their Upcountry Economic Memorandum, they detail a pretty clear roadmap for these reforms across 4 key areas. The biggest hurdle, as we've really hammered home today, is the lack of political will and, crucially, political continuity to actually implement them consistently and see them through.
Politics can. So let's dive into the first area identified in that roadmap, making more of migration. How do we leverage that significant outflow of talent and capital more effectively?
Well, a systemic approach here needs to go way beyond just counting the remittance money coming in. Policies should really aim to reduce the costs for migrants, the fees they pay, the risks they face. Also, ensuring their rights and security through effective bilateral labor agreements with host countries is critical. And, perhaps most importantly, creating programs that actively help returning migrants reintegrate into the domestic economy, helping them use their accumulated capital and newly acquired skills to start their own businesses back home. This is about leveraging their contribution much more effectively within Nepal, not just seeing them as a source of foreign currency, but as a potential source of entrepreneurial energy, too.
Okay, that makes sense. The second area is improving export efficiency. How can Nepal start to tackle that chronic trade deficit and build a more robust domestic economy that actually sells things abroad?
This needs a combination of measures, really. It includes things like increasing competition in key domestic markets to boost efficiency. Addressing critical infrastructure bottlenecks is huge. For instance, the FNCCI, The Business Federation proposes upgrading airports, setting up cold storage facilities for agricultural exports to reduce spoilage. Basic but vital things.
Mhm.
Also, managing inflationary pressures, as we discussed, to maintain the price competitiveness of Nepalese goods internationally. And then there's the procedural side, simplifying procedures for tax refunds on imported raw materials that exporters use, and reducing import duties on necessary inputs, essentially making it easier and more profitable for businesses to export.
Got it. And what about harnessing the potential of hydropower? You mentioned earlier it's so vital but just plagued by these delays. What's the fix there?
Yeah, attracting the massive investment needed for hydropower requires developing a clear and, most importantly, a stable financing strategy, something investors can rely on for years, not months. This could involve developing a domestic bond market, maybe, creating an effective, transparent legal framework for large public-private partnerships, PPPs. But the absolute key, the thing everyone agrees on, is radically simplifying the licensing process and cutting through that bureaucratic red tape that currently just strangles projects and discourages investors. Without stability and simplicity in the process, that enormous potential will just remain untapped, a constant, frustrating reminder of what could be.
And finally, the fourth area, stimulating the digital sector. How can Nepal properly enter the digital age and maybe create some new avenues for growth there?
Nepal really must accelerate its digital transformation. It's lagging behind. This requires, first off, updating the very outdated Telecommunications Act. It needs to reflect modern realities, investing significantly more in digital infrastructure across the country, broadband access, data centers, and critically, addressing the pervasive lack of digital skills among the population. This is a big one. You need to integrate digital literacy right into school curricula from an early age, and also create targeted training courses for different age groups, different social groups, workers who need retraining. Building a digitally competent workforce and fostering a thriving tech ecosystem has to become a real national priority.
So Nepal, as we wrap up, it really is a country of enormous but largely untapped potential, isn't it? It seems to have all the prerequisites for an economic breakthrough, from that incredible hydropower potential to a young, dynamic workforce that seems eager for opportunity.
Absolutely. Yet, as we've seen, this potential remains hostage to a political culture that's defined by chronic instability, by power struggles driven mainly by personal ambitions, and as a result, a paralyzed state machine that seems incapable of implementing these vital, often well-understood reforms.
Which brings us right back to our central question for you, the listener, to ponder. Is this current grand coalition a last, maybe desperate attempt by the political elite to finally break this vicious circle and achieve some stability? Or is it just a lull, a brief pause before a new, possibly even more destructive political storm hits? For businesses looking at Nepal, despite those clear opportunities in tourism, IT, hydropower, and despite some government attempts to improve the climate, the forecast really has to remain one of cautious pessimism, doesn't it?
I think so, yes.
Political instability just consistently seems to outweigh the advantages. It renders those campaigns like FNCCI's Invest in Nepal somewhat unconvincing when parliamentary blockades installed FDI are the daily news headlines. And for citizens, well, the future looks pretty bleak, too, under the current trajectory. That youth exodus is likely to continue as long as domestic job creation stagnates. And despite those low official inflation figures, the real prices for essential goods, the cost of living, it's unlikely to fall significantly without fundamental improvements in production, logistics, and maybe competition. That persistent gap between the official statistics and people's daily reality, it will surely continue to fuel public discontent and frustration.
And ultimately, the well-being of Nepal's citizens depends directly, doesn't it, on the ability of the political class to actually implement those structural reforms we've talked about. But until the politicians can somehow overcome their internal strife, their focus on short-term power gains, well, the economic aspirations of the Nepalese people will likely remain unfulfilled. And this raises perhaps a final provocative thought for you. What does Nepal's situation tell us more broadly about the fragile nature of democratic stability and economic progress, especially when that crucial political will remains elusive, when the political class appears unwilling or perhaps unable to put the country's long-term needs above their own immediate ambitions?
Something to definitely think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.